He slid the divorce papers across the polished mahogany table with the smug, self-satisfied smirk of a man who believed he had won everything. Arthur thought cutting ties with his quiet, unassuming wife would be the easiest business transaction of his life. He was the rising tech CEO. She was just the simple girl he had outgrown, someone he tossed aside for a younger, flashier model. He offered her pennies, expecting tears, begging, or a drawn-out legal battle. Instead, she picked up the pen and signed her name without a moment's hesitation. He thought she was walking away with nothing. He didn't know that in exactly 3 weeks, the most ruthless billionaire in the country would step up to a microphone, look directly at her, and say the 2 words that would destroy Arthur's entire existence: "My daughter." The law offices of Harrison, Cole and Associates sat on the 42nd floor of a sleek Manhattan high-rise, smelling of leather-bound books, expensive espresso, and ruthless efficiency. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining sideways against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a dull, grey light over the conference room. Arthur Sterling, no relation to the billionaire family of the same name, a fact that had always secretly irked him, sat with his posture perfectly straight, checking his Rolex. Beside him sat Chloe, his vice president of public relations, and for the last 8 months, his entirely too public mistress. Chloe wore a stark white tailored suit, a silent, mocking declaration of the wedding she was already planning. Across from them sat Clara. For 5 years, Clara had been Arthur's wife. When they met, he was a struggling software developer, operating out of a cramped Brooklyn apartment. She was working as a freelance illustrator, dressed in oversized sweaters and faded jeans, always smelling faintly of vanilla and graphite. She was soft-spoken, endlessly supportive, and seemingly completely untethered to the material world. When Arthur's company, Aegis Tech, finally secured its first major round of venture capital, their dynamic shifted. Arthur bought the designer suits, the imported sports cars, and the luxury penthouse. Clara, however, remained exactly the same. She preferred thrifted books to charity galas and quiet dinners at home to the Michelin-starred networking events Arthur dragged her to. To Arthur, Clara had become an anchor, weighing down his ascent to the elite circles of New York high society. To Chloe, Clara was an obstacle, a naive, unremarkable woman who had simply lucked into marrying a man destined for greatness. "Let's get this over with, David," Arthur said, tapping his fingers impatiently against the glass table. "I have a board meeting at 4. Aegis is preparing for a massive merger, and I don't have time to dawdle on personal housekeeping." David Harrison, a shark of a divorce attorney who charged $1,000 an hour, slid a thick stack of documents across the table toward Clara. "Mrs. Sterling," David began, his voice dripping with practiced, patronizing sympathy. "As per the prenuptial agreement you signed 5 years ago, the terms of this dissolution are quite straightforward. Arthur is retaining full ownership of Aegis Tech, the Manhattan penthouse, and the house in the Hamptons. In exchange, he is offering a one-time settlement of $100,000, and you will retain ownership of the 2018 Volvo." Chloe let out a soft, breathy chuckle, leaning in to whisper something in Arthur's ear. Arthur smirked, his eyes locked on Clara, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He expected her to cry. He expected her to demand more money, to threaten to leak stories of his infidelity to the press. He had instructed his PR team to prepare for a smear campaign, drafting press releases that painted Clara as an unstable, gold-digging ex-wife who simply couldn't keep up with his high-pressure lifestyle. Clara looked at the papers. She didn't cry. Her breathing didn't hitch. She simply reached into a worn leather tote bag, pulled out a cheap plastic pen, and clicked it. "Clara," Arthur said, leaning forward, feigning a tone of magnanimous pity. "I want to be fair. I know this is hard for you. You don't have a real career, and adjusting to a normal life is going to be difficult. If you need me to cover a few months of rent in a sensible apartment in Queens or somewhere, I can do that. Consider it severance." Clara paused, the tip of her pen hovering over the signature line. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Arthur's. For a fleeting second, Arthur felt a strange, icy chill run down his spine. There was no pain in her eyes. There was no devastation. There was only a profound, almost chilling emptiness. "That won't be necessary, Arthur," Clara said, her voice smooth and completely devoid of emotion. She signed her name, Clara M. She flipped to the next page, initialed it, and then signed the final decree. The whole process took less than 30 seconds. When she was done, she capped her pen, stood up, and slid the papers back to the lawyer. "I'll have my things out of the penthouse by tomorrow evening," Clara said. She buttoned her simple beige trench coat, slung her bag over her shoulder, and looked at Chloe. "He prefers his coffee black, but he'll tell you he likes a splash of oat milk when investors are around because he thinks it makes him look progressive, and he grinds his teeth when the stock drops. Good luck to you both." Without another word, Clara walked out of the conference room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Arthur blinked, looking at the freshly signed papers. There had been no fight, no demands for his assets. It was entirely too easy. "Well," Chloe said, breaking the silence, her tone laced with a mix of relief and subtle disappointment that she didn't get to witness a catfight. "I guess she knows she's out of her league. She probably knows she wouldn't stand a chance against your lawyers anyway." "Yeah," Arthur muttered, though a nagging sense of unease settled in his stomach. "Yeah, exactly. She knows her place." What Arthur didn't know, what he was entirely too arrogant to ever investigate, was why Clara had never let him meet her family. He didn't know why she insisted on a fiercely guarded private life, or why, when they got married at a small courthouse, she had legally dropped her maiden name entirely, going only by Clara M. Arthur thought he had just cut loose dead weight. He had no idea he had just severed his only tie to the one thing he worshipped above all else: absolute, untouchable power. 3 weeks later, the reality of Arthur's corporate life was entirely less glamorous than the image he projected. Aegis Tech was bleeding money. A critical flaw in their flagship software had caused a major client to pull out, and Arthur was desperately trying to keep the news out of the press. He needed an infusion of capital. Badly. He needed a lifeline, and there was only one place to get it: the Sterling Rothschild Invitational. It was the most exclusive charity gala in New York City, held annually at the legendary Pierre Hotel. It was a room where billions of dollars changed hands over glasses of Dom Perignon and plates of beluga caviar. The guest list was a closely guarded secret, heavily curated by the event's host, Jonathan Kensington. Jonathan Kensington was a titan. He was a real estate and private equity mogul whose net worth rivaled small nations. He was a man who occasionally golfed with Warren Buffett and could tank a Fortune 500 company's stock with a single, disparaging tweet. Getting into the Kensington Gala was nearly impossible. Arthur had spent 6 months, pulled a dozen strings, and promised equity in his company just to secure 2 tickets. "This is it, Chloe," Arthur said, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo as they stepped out of their black SUV. "Kensington's venture capital arm, K Global, is looking to invest in tech infrastructure. If I can get 5 minutes with Jonathan tonight, Aegis is saved, and we catapult into the billionaire bracket." Chloe beamed, adjusting the neckline of her plunging red silk gown. "You've got this, baby. You belong here. Not like—" She trailed off, but Arthur knew exactly who she meant. They entered the grand ballroom of the Pierre. The sheer opulence of the room was staggering. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the crowd of politicians, A-list celebrities, and Wall Street tycoons. Waiters in white gloves floated through the room with trays of champagne. Arthur grabbed 2 glasses and immediately began scanning the room, mentally cataloguing the power players. There was the CEO of Morgan Stanley near the ice sculpture. There was a prominent senator laughing near the stage. Arthur's heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and raw ambition. "Arthur, look over by the balcony," Chloe whispered, her grip suddenly tightening on his arm. Her voice had dropped to a frantic, confused hiss. "Is that—" Arthur followed her gaze. Standing near the French doors leading to the terrace, engaged in a quiet conversation with a prominent tech billionaire Arthur had been trying to secure a meeting with for years, was a woman. She was wearing a breathtaking, custom Oscar de la Renta gown in deep, midnight blue. The dress clung to her figure perfectly, adorned with subtle, shimmering beadwork that caught the light like stars. Around her neck rested a diamond collar that Arthur, even with his limited knowledge of fine jewelry, knew was worth more than his entire company. Her hair was swept up in an elegant, intricate style, and she held a glass of sparkling water with an air of effortless grace. It was Clara. Arthur froze, the champagne glass in his hand tilted dangerously. His brain scrambled to make sense of the image before him. Clara, his ex-wife, the woman who shopped at thrift stores and painted in a drafty spare room, here at the Kensington Gala. "What is she doing here?" Chloe hissed, her face flushing with instant defensive anger. "How did she even get in? Did she track us down?" "Arthur, this is pathetic. She's stalking you." Arthur's mind raced. "She must have slept her way in, or she's working here as an escort for one of the older executives," he muttered, though the sheer authority radiating from Clara made that excuse sound hollow even to him. "Stay here. I'll handle this. I won't let her ruin this night for us." Arthur marched across the ballroom, dodging waitstaff and socialites. He approached the balcony just as the tech billionaire Clara was speaking to, nodded respectfully and walked away. "Clara," Arthur snapped, keeping his voice low but lacing it with venom. Clara turned. She didn't look startled. She didn't look nervous. She looked at Arthur the way one might look at a mildly annoying insect that had landed on a window pane. "Arthur," she replied evenly. "Good evening." "What the hell are you doing here?" Arthur demanded, stepping closer to intimidate her. "How did you get past security? This isn't a soup kitchen, Clara. You can't just sneak in here to try and beg me to take you back." Clara took a slow sip of her water. "I didn't sneak in, Arthur. And I assure you the last thing on this earth I want is you." Chloe appeared at Arthur's side, unable to resist the confrontation. She looked Clara up and down, her eyes narrowing at the obvious expense of Clara's gown. "Who rented that dress for you, Clara? Did you max out the 50 grand Arthur gave you already? You're going to embarrass yourself. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling security." "You are welcome to try, Chloe," Clara said, a faint, almost pitying smile touching her lips. "But I wouldn't recommend making a scene. The host is very particular about decorum. You don't know the first thing about the host," Arthur sneered. "Jonathan Kensington is a legend. You're a footnote. If you aren't out of this building in 2 minutes, I will personally drag you to the exit. I am not letting your pathetic obsession with me ruin my meeting with Kensington." Before Clara could respond, a low, melodic chime echoed through the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing. The murmuring crowd fell into an immediate, hushed silence. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing on the grand stage at the front of the room. "It's starting," Arthur whispered to Chloe, his attention instantly snapping away from Clara. The desperation in his eyes returned. "Come on, we need to get to the front." Arthur and Chloe pushed their way through the crowd, leaving Clara standing by the balcony. They managed to secure a spot near the front row, directly in the eye line of the podium. A man stepped up to the microphone. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair, sharp, intelligent eyes, and an aura of absolute authority. It was Jonathan Kensington. The crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause. Jonathan held up a hand, and the room went dead silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jonathan began, his voice deep and commanding, resonating through the high-tech sound system. "We have raised a record-breaking amount for the Global Education Initiative, but tonight is not just about charity. Tonight is a personal milestone." Arthur leaned in, his heart hammering. This is it, he thought. He's announcing a new fund, a new direction for K Global. "For the last decade, I have run my empire with one eye on the present and one eye on the future," Jonathan continued, pacing slowly across the stage. "But a legacy is only as strong as the people who inherit it. For years, the media has speculated about my successor. They have wondered why my only child has been shielded from the public eye, kept away from the boardrooms and the press." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Arthur frowned. He had read the dossiers on Kensington. Everyone knew he had a daughter, but she was a ghost. No photos, no public records. Some rumored she was institutionalized. Others said she lived off-grid in Europe. "My daughter made a choice 5 years ago," Jonathan said, a soft, proud smile breaking through his stern facade. "She wanted to understand the world without the safety net of the Kensington name. She wanted to know if people valued her for her mind, her heart, and her talent, rather than the balance of her trust fund. She wanted to live a normal life." Jonathan's eyes scanned the crowd. Arthur felt a strange, cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. "She has lived that life. She has learned the harsh realities of how people treat you when they think you have nothing to offer them but yourself." Jonathan's voice hardened slightly, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. "And having learned those lessons, she is ready to take her rightful place." Jonathan stopped pacing. He looked directly out over the crowd, past Arthur, towards the back of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, my greatest pride, the sole heir to the Kensington Empire, and the newly appointed co-CEO of K Global," Jonathan announced, his voice booming. "My daughter, Clara Kensington." For 3 agonizing seconds, the ballroom of the Pierre was trapped in a vacuum of silence. Arthur's brain simply refused to process the words. Clara Kensington. The syllables hit him like physical blows, but they made no sense. His Clara? The woman who clipped coupons? The woman he had berated for buying expensive organic vegetables when they were saving for their first house? The spotlight snapped away from the stage, cutting through the darkness of the room like a physical blade, sweeping over the crowd until it illuminated the balcony. There, bathed in the stark white light, stood Clara. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Billionaires, senators, and Wall Street titans turned, their faces breaking into polite, eager smiles, desperate to catch a glimpse of the newly crowned queen of the financial world. Arthur didn't clap. He couldn't move. Beside him, Chloe let out a sound that was half gasp, half choke. Her face had drained of all color, matching the stark white of the silk dress she wore. Clara began to walk. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, falling over themselves to make way. The gentle, submissive woman Arthur had known for 5 years was entirely gone. In her place was a predator walking through her own territory. Her posture was flawless, her gaze fixed securely on her father at the podium. She didn't even glance at the elite crowd murmuring her name. As she passed Arthur and Chloe, the distance between them was less than 3 feet. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He reached out a trembling hand, acting entirely on a desperate, broken instinct. "Clara," he whispered. The word was swallowed instantly by the roaring applause, but she heard it. Clara paused for a fraction of a second. She turned her head, looking down at Arthur's outstretched, shaking hand. Her dark eyes, the same eyes that had looked so empty in the lawyer's office 3 weeks ago, now burned with a terrifying, absolute power. She didn't say a word. She just let a slow, chilling smile curve her lips, a smile that promised total, unmitigated ruin, before turning her face forward and gliding up the stairs to the stage. Jonathan Kensington embraced his daughter warmly, kissing her cheek before stepping back to yield the microphone to her. Clara adjusted the stand. When she spoke, Her voice was the same soft cadence Arthur knew, but it carried the immense weight of $1 billion empire. "Thank you, Father," Clara said, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, "and thank you all for your warm welcome. For the past 5 years, I have had the unique privilege of living incognito. I learned how the world operates when money is removed from the equation. I learned about struggle, about ambition, and, most importantly, about character." Arthur felt his knees go weak. Character. She was talking about him. She was talking to a room full of the most powerful people in the world about him. "I learned that true integrity is rare," Clara continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, briefly stopping exactly where Arthur stood. "I learned that many people will build their castles on the backs of those they deem beneath them, entirely unaware of the foundations they are cracking." Chloe grabbed Arthur's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Arthur," she whimpered, her voice trembling violently. "Arthur, what do we do? She's—" Arthur couldn't answer. The reality was crashing down on him with the force of an avalanche. Aegis Tech was on the brink of bankruptcy. His only hope for survival was a cash injection from K Global. He had spent the last 2 years treating his wife like an outdated accessory, openly parading his affair, and ruthlessly discarding her with a heavily ironclad prenup. A prenup that he had drafted to protect his assets, a prenup that Clara had signed without a fight because $50,000 and a used Volvo meant absolutely nothing to a woman whose trust fund could buy his company 100 times over. "Effective tomorrow morning, K Global will be restructuring its venture capital portfolio," Clara announced, her tone shifting from philosophical to strictly business. "We will be actively liquidating our positions in companies that do not align with our new ethical guidelines. We are no longer simply investing in technology. We are investing in leadership, and leadership requires integrity." A collective murmur of anxiety rippled through the tech entrepreneurs in the room. Arthur felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Then it buzzed again, and again. He pulled it out with shaking hands. It was David Harrison, his divorce lawyer. He ignored it. Then a text came through from his CFO. "Arthur, just got a tip from an insider at Goldman. K Global is hostile shorting Aegis. They're dumping shares into the market. What the hell did you do?" Arthur stared at the screen, the words blurring. He looked back up at the stage. Clara was wrapping up her speech, receiving another standing ovation. She was radiant, untouchable. He had thought she was a naive, simple girl. He thought he was the mastermind, the alpha, the winner. Instead, he realized with a sickening twist in his gut, he had been nothing more than a case study. Clara hadn't been a victim in their marriage. She had been a silent observer, taking notes, waiting to see if the man she married would become a monster when given a little bit of money and power. He had failed her test spectacularly, and now the professor was handing back the graded exam. "Let's get out of here," Arthur choked out, grabbing Chloe's wrist. "Now!" "But Arthur, the meeting," Chloe started, still unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the situation. "There is no meeting, Chloe," Arthur hissed, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "We are dead. My company is dead. We need to leave before she decides to humiliate us in front of everyone." They turned to push their way through the crowd, but their path was suddenly blocked. Standing in front of them were 2 massive security guards in dark suits, earpieces curled tightly behind their ears. Behind the guards stood a severe-looking woman holding an iPad. "Mr. Sterling," the woman said, her voice crisp and icy. "I am Miss Kensington's executive assistant. Miss Kensington has requested a brief, private word with you in the green room. Now." Arthur swallowed hard. He looked at Chloe, who was shrinking back, terrified. He looked at the guards. There was no running from this. The game he thought he was playing had just been flipped off the table. "Okay," Arthur managed to say, his voice cracking. "Lead the way." As he followed the guards through the labyrinthine halls of the Pierre Hotel, away from the music and the champagne, Arthur realized the terrifying truth. Divorcing Clara hadn't been a clean break. It had been his execution order, and he had gleefully handed her the axe. The walk from the grand ballroom to the green room felt like a death march. The pulsing bass of the gala's orchestra faded behind the heavy, velvet-lined doors of the Pierre Hotel's private corridors, replaced by the suffocating silence of Arthur's own panicked breathing. Chloe practically dragged her feet beside him, her earlier arrogance entirely evaporated. The executive assistant stopped in front of a set of double mahogany doors, tapped twice, and pushed them open. "Mr. Sterling and his guest, Miss Kensington," the assistant announced, her voice flat. She stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter, and then firmly pulled the doors shut behind them. The click of the lock sounded like a gavel falling. The room was a masterclass in understated billionaire luxury. Antique Persian rugs muffled their footsteps, and the scent of fresh white lilies filled the air. Sitting casually in a high-backed emerald leather armchair was Clara. She had a crystal glass of sparkling water resting on her knee, and she was scrolling through a sleek, matte black tablet. She didn't look up immediately. She let them stand there for a full 30 seconds, absorbing the suffocating power dynamic. Arthur's bespoke Tom Ford suit suddenly felt cheap, tight, and entirely inadequate. "Clara," Arthur croaked. He cleared his throat, trying desperately to summon the dominant, commanding CEO persona he had worn for 5 years. It failed completely. "Clara, I don't understand." Clara finally locked her tablet and set it on the polished mahogany side table. She crossed her legs, leaning back into the leather, her eyes sweeping over Arthur, then shifting briefly to Chloe, who was trembling like a wet leaf. "What is there to understand, Arthur?" Clara asked, her tone conversational, yet laced with absolute frost. "You wanted a divorce because I didn't fit into your newly minted high society lifestyle. You wanted me out of your penthouse, off your cap table, and out of your life. I obliged. I even let you keep the espresso machine." "You lied to me," Arthur stammered, his defense mechanism kicking in. "For 5 years. You pretended to be a struggling artist. You let me pay for everything. Let me build my company from scratch, while you just watched." Clara let out a short, hollow laugh that sent a chill straight down Arthur's spine. "You built your company from scratch," Clara repeated, leaning forward. The amusement vanished from her face, replaced by a terrifying, cold precision. "Arthur, do you really believe your own PR spin? Aegis Tech didn't take off because of your networking skills. It took off because of the Project Sentinel algorithmic framework." Arthur swallowed hard. Project Sentinel was the crown jewel of Aegis. It was the proprietary data encryption code that had secured them contracts with the Department of Defense and major banks like Barclays and Chase. "I coded the baseline for Sentinel," Arthur argued defensively. "You coded a broken and buggy mess that failed 3 stress tests in our Brooklyn apartment," Clara corrected sharply. "You were going to scrap it. Do you remember who stayed up for 3 weeks straight, rewriting the entire architecture in C++? Do you remember who quietly patched the backdoor vulnerabilities while you were out at happy hours trying to secure seed money?" Arthur's face drained of color. He remembered. He had always known Clara was good with computers. She had a degree in software engineering that she casually mentioned she didn't use because she preferred illustration. When he was drowning in code, she had offered to look at it. He had taken the credit, and over the years, he had genuinely convinced himself he had done the heavy lifting. "I didn't steal it," Arthur whispered. "We were married. It was community property." "Actually, it wasn't," Clara said, picking up a manila folder from the table. She tossed it onto the glass coffee table between them. "Open it." Arthur's hands shook as he picked up the folder. Inside was a copy of the divorce settlement he had so smugly forced her to sign. Next to it was an intellectual property audit report from K Global's legal team. "When you presented me with that ironclad prenuptial agreement, You specifically stipulated that any intellectual property generated during the marriage remained the sole property of its original creator, explicitly protecting your claim to Aegis, Clara explained, her voice steady and merciless. You were so paranoid I would take half your company that you legally separated our digital assets. Arthur read the highlighted text. His stomach plummeted. I documented every line of code I wrote for Sentinel, Arthur. I time-stamped it, encrypted it, and filed the patents under a shell company owned by Kensington Global, Clara continued. You don't own the architecture of your own software. You've been licensing it, illegally, for 4 years. Oh my God, Chloe whispered, taking a physical step away from Arthur. She looked at him with a mixture of horror and sudden, fierce self-preservation. Arthur, is she telling the truth? Do you not own the code? Shut up, Chloe, Arthur snapped, his eyes wild with panic. He looked back at Clara. Clara, please. You know this will destroy Aegis. If word gets out that the IP is contested, our DoD contracts will be nullified overnight. The company will be worthless. The company is worthless, Arthur, Clara said simply, because I already notified the Department of Defense an hour ago, and the SEC, and your primary investors at Vanguard. Arthur collapsed onto the velvet sofa opposite Clara, his head in his hands. He couldn't breathe. It was a total, unmitigated slaughter. Why didn't you just take half in the divorce? Arthur choked out. Why do this? Why humiliate me? Because you didn't just want a divorce, Arthur. You wanted to discard me, Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. You paraded Chloe around our favorite restaurants while we were still married. You moved my grandmother's antique desk out of the apartment to make room for her Pilates equipment before the papers were even filed. You offered me $100,000 and a used car, expecting me to beg you for crumbs. You needed to break me to feel powerful. Clara stood up, smoothing out the front of her Oscar de la Renta gown. She looked down at the two of them, resembling a queen inspecting a ruined battlefield. I gave you every opportunity to be a good man, Clara said. You chose to be a ruthless one. Now you're going to find out what real ruthlessness looks like. Chloe suddenly rushed forward, ignoring Arthur entirely. Miss Kensington, Chloe pleaded, her voice sickeningly sweet and desperate. I had no idea. He lied to me too. He told me you were unhinged, that the marriage was over years ago. I was manipulated. Please, I have my own PR firm to think about. Don't drag my name into this. Arthur looked at Chloe, utterly betrayed. Chloe, what are you doing? Chloe didn't even look at him. She kept her pleading eyes on Clara. Clara let out a disappointed sigh. Chloe, your PR firm's largest retainer is with Aegis Tech, which means by tomorrow afternoon, your firm will also be bankrupt. I suggest you update your resume. Clara walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the brass handle. Enjoy the rest of the gala, Arthur. It will be the last time you ever see the inside of this room. By 8:30 a.m. the next morning, the rain in Manhattan had turned into a torrential downpour, mirroring the absolute catastrophe unfolding on the 40th floor of the Aegis Tech building. Arthur had not slept. He had spent the entire night pacing his penthouse, chain-smoking, a habit he had kicked 3 years ago, and screaming at his lawyers over the phone. Every single attorney at Harrison, Cole and Associates had suddenly become unavailable, citing massive conflicts of interest. The Kensington name was absolute poison to anyone standing on the wrong side of it. When Arthur stepped off the private elevator into his executive suite, the atmosphere was chaotic. Telephones were ringing incessantly, a cacophony of shrill, panicked alarms. Junior analysts were practically running down the glass-walled hallways, clutching thick stacks of financial printouts. Arthur! Arthur flinched as Richard Hayes, his chairman of the board, stormed out of the main conference room. Richard was a veteran venture capitalist, a man who usually moved with deliberate, icy calm. Today, his tie was loosened, his face was flushed purple with rage, and he was clutching a Bloomberg terminal printout so tightly his knuckles were white. "What the hell is going on, Richard?" Arthur asked, trying to project a false bravado. "Tell the floor to calm down. We're experiencing a targeted short attack. We just need to put out a press release." "A press release?" Richard roared, shoving the printout into Arthur's chest. "Have you looked at the pre-market indicators, you arrogant fool? The stock hasn't just dipped, Arthur. It's in free fall. We are down 62% before the opening bell." Arthur's eyes darted to the numbers. His breath hitched. 62%. Hundreds of millions of dollars of market cap, vaporized into the ether overnight. "Vanguard called at 6 a.m., Richard continued, his voice echoing through the bullpen, causing a dozen employees to stop and stare. "They're dumping their entire position. The Pentagon just issued a stop work order on the Sentinel contract, citing an ongoing federal investigation into intellectual property fraud. Arthur, they are saying we don't own our own code. They are saying K Global owns it." "It's a misunderstanding," Arthur lied, his voice trembling. "It's a vindictive ex-wife playing games. I can fix this. I'll call Kensington." "You won't call anyone," Richard snapped. "Goldman Sachs just issued a margin call on the corporate loan you took out to finance the Silicon Valley expansion. They want $50 million in cash by noon, or they seize the collateral." Arthur felt his knees buckle. He reached out to grab the edge of an assistant's desk to steady himself. The collateral for that loan was his majority shares in Aegis, along with the deeds to his Manhattan penthouse and the Hamptons estate. He had leveraged his entire life on the assumption that Aegis would hit $1 billion valuation by Q3. "We don't have $50 million in liquid capital," Arthur whispered, the reality finally piercing his delusion. "I know we don't," Richard said coldly, "which is why the board convened an emergency vote at 7 a.m. this morning." A cold sweat broke out across Arthur's forehead. "An emergency vote? Without me? I'm the CEO, Richard. I'm the founder." "Not anymore," Richard said, signaling with his hand. Two large security guards, Aegis's own building security, stepped out from behind the glass doors of the boardroom. They flanked Arthur, their expressions entirely neutral. "Effective immediately, you are terminated as Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Tech, pending a full forensic audit of your actions," Richard stated, reciting the legal jargon with venomous pleasure. "You are stripped of your board seat and barred from the premises. A formal press release is going out in 5 minutes, distancing the company from you." "You can't do this," Arthur shouted, his voice cracking as panic set in. He looked around the bullpen. The employees who used to cower when he walked past were now watching him with a mixture of shock and quiet satisfaction. "I built this place. I own 51% of the voting shares." "You did," a new, smooth voice echoed from the elevator bank. The entire floor fell dead silent. Stepping out of the elevator, flanked by 3 men in sharp navy blue legal suits, was Clara. She was no longer wearing the ball gown. Today she wore a razor-sharp, charcoal-grey Alexander McQueen suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, sleek bun. She looked every inch the corporate executioner she had become. "Miss Kensington," Richard Hayes said, immediately dropping his hostile tone and stepping forward with a polite, deferential nod. Arthur stared at her, utterly bewildered. "Clara, what are you doing in my building?" Clara walked past Arthur as if he were a piece of misplaced furniture. She approached Richard and accepted a thick, leather-bound folder from one of her lawyers. "As of 8:45 a.m., K Global Holdings has purchased Aegis Tech's outstanding debt from Goldman Sachs," Clara announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent trading floor. She turned slowly to face Arthur. "Which means, Arthur, when you fail to meet your margin call at noon, and we both know you don't have $50 million in your checking account, K Global will formally seize your 51% equity." Arthur felt the room spinning. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, drowning out his thoughts. "You planned this," Arthur gasped, pointing a shaking finger at her. "The divorce, the gala. You orchestrated all of this just to steal my company." "I didn't steal anything, Arthur. I simply stopped letting you take the credit for my work," Clara replied, her tone perfectly even. "You built a house of cards on a foundation of lies and my intellectual property. All I did was pull out the bottom card and let gravity do the rest." She gestured towards the security guards. "Escort Mr. Sterling off my property. He has exactly 5 minutes to clear out his desk. Anything left behind will be considered corporate collateral." Arthur tried to plant his feet, tried to summon some last shred of dignity to fight back. But there was nothing left. The security guards grabbed him by the biceps, their grips unyielding. As they marched him backward toward his office to collect a cardboard box, Arthur looked over his shoulder. Clara was already at the head of the boardroom table, surrounded by the board of directors who had worshipped Arthur just yesterday. She was pointing at the financial charts, commanding the room with effortless authority. He had walked into a lawyer's office 3 weeks ago, expecting to throw away a useless piece of his past. Instead, he had handed the keys to his empire directly to his executioner, and she hadn't just taken his company. As Arthur was shoved into the elevator with a single box of personal belongings, his phone buzzed. It was an automated email from his bank. His personal accounts were frozen, pending the Goldman Sachs asset seizure. He was broke. The rain had stopped by the time Arthur's Uber pulled up to the curb of Chloe's Upper East Side apartment building, but the chill in the air bit through his thin cotton dress shirt. He had left his bespoke overcoat in his office, Clara's office now. His credit cards had all been declined when he tried to book a room at the Four Seasons, and his frantic calls to his so-called friends in the Hamptons elite had gone straight to voicemail. News traveled fast in Manhattan, but news of a billionaire's wrath traveled at the speed of light. Arthur bypassed the doorman, his face pale and haggard, and rode the elevator up to the 12th floor. He needed a drink. He needed a shower. Mostly he needed Chloe's PR brain to figure out a spin for this disaster. If they could just craft the right narrative, paint Clara as a vindictive, unstable heiress abusing her father's power, maybe he could salvage a shred of his reputation. He keyed his access code into Chloe's door and pushed it open. The apartment was a disaster zone. Designer clothes were strewn across the white leather sofas. 4 massive Louis Vuitton trunks lay open on the hardwood floor, rapidly being filled with shoes, handbags, and jewelry. Chloe was pacing in the center of the room, her phone pressed so hard against her ear that her knuckles were white. She had stripped off her gala gown and was wearing Lululemon leggings and an oversized cashmere sweater. "Listen to me, Simon!" Chloe was practically screaming into the phone, her voice shrill with panic. "You cannot drop us. Apex Public Relations has handled the Sterling account flawlessly. This is a personal dispute between Arthur and his ex-wife. It has nothing to do with our corporate retainers with your firm." Arthur froze in the entryway. Simon? Simon Hastings was the CEO of a major logistics company that made up 30% of Chloe's firm's revenue. Chloe stopped pacing. She listened for a few seconds, her face crumpling into a mask of pure terror. "Simon, please. Global is just throwing their weight around. You don't have to listen to them." "Simon! Simon!" She pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the screen. He had hung up. "Chloe," Arthur said softly, stepping into the living room. "What's going on?" Chloe whipped her head around. When she saw Arthur, the terror in her eyes instantly morphed into a toxic, unadulterated hatred. She didn't run to him. She didn't offer comfort. She looked at him like he was carrying a highly contagious disease. "What is going on?" Chloe hissed, marching toward him. She stopped just out of arm's reach. "What's going on is that my firm is dead. Simon Hastings just terminated our contract. So did Harrison Fitch. So did the board of directors at the Metropolitan Charity League. Every single client my firm has represented for the last 3 years has dropped us in the last 4 hours." "That's impossible," Arthur stammered, his mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of the blitzkrieg. Contracts have penalty clauses. They can't just walk away. K Global offered to pay every single termination penalty, Chloe snapped, tears of rage finally spilling over her mascara. Clara Kensington's legal team sent a blanket memo to every major corporation in the tri-state area. Anyone who does business with Apex Public Relations or Arthur Sterling will be permanently blacklisted from K Global's investment portfolios. You know what that means, Arthur? It means you are radioactive, and because I hitched my wagon to you, I am too. Arthur reached out, trying to grab her hands. Chloe, baby, listen to me. We can fix this. We just need to lay low for a few weeks. The news cycle will move on. I still have my contacts in Silicon Valley. We can fly to California. I can start a new firm. We can rebuild. Chloe ripped her hands away from him, letting out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. Rebuild? With what money, Arthur? She gestured wildly around the room. Your bank accounts are frozen. The penthouse is locked down. My firm's operating accounts were just flagged for an emergency audit by the IRS, which I'm sure Clara also arranged. I don't have time to lay low with a broke, disgraced ex-CEO who doesn't even know how to write the code he claimed he invented. The words hit Arthur harder than a physical blow. The illusion of their glamorous, unstoppable power couple dynamic shattered into a million jagged pieces. You don't mean that, Arthur whispered, the reality of his isolation finally sinking in. You love me. We were going to get married. I loved the CEO of Aegis Tech, Chloe corrected him, her voice dropping to a ruthless, pragmatic whisper. It was the same tone Arthur had used when he fired people. I loved the man who was going to take me to the Forbes 400 list. I didn't sign up to play nursemaid to a fraud who got outplayed by a woman who shops at thrift stores. She turned her back on him, walking over to her luggage and zipping the nearest trunk shut with brutal finality. I have a flight to London in 3 hours, Chloe said without looking at him. I have an old friend there who runs a boutique agency. She might be able to get me an entry-level consulting gig under the radar until the heat dies down. But you are not coming with me. Chloe, please, Arthur begged. His pride entirely evaporated. He was a man drowning, grasping at a viper to stay afloat. I have nowhere to go. My cards are declined. I can't even get a hotel room. There's a couch in the lobby of the YMCA on 47th Street, Chloe replied coldly. She grabbed her designer purse and slung it over her shoulder. Leave your keys on the counter. And Arthur, don't ever contact me again. She walked past him, her expensive perfume lingering in the air long after the heavy apartment door clicked shut behind her. Arthur stood alone in the half-empty, devastated apartment. The silence was deafening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened his banking app. Available balance. $54,230.12. The margin call had hit. The seizure had begun. He had discarded Clara because he thought she was holding him back from having everything. Now, standing in the ruins of his life, Arthur realized she hadn't been holding him back. She had been holding him up, and he had just kicked away the only pillar that supported his sky. 7 months later. The persistent, rhythmic dripping of a leaky radiator was the only sound in the cramped, one-bedroom apartment in Staten Island. The walls were painted a depressing shade of institutional beige, and the single window looked out over a damp, trash-strewn alleyway. Arthur Sterling sat at a rickety card table, hunched over a cheap, refurbished laptop. He was wearing a faded grey sweatshirt and jeans that had lost their shape months ago. His hair was longer, unkempt, and the sharp, predatory gleam in his eyes had been replaced by a dull, hollow exhaustion. He clicked submit on his 42nd job application of the week. This one was for a mid-level project manager position at a third-tier logistics software company in New Jersey. The salary was $80,000 a year, less than what he used to spend on a single weekend in Aspen. He knew, even as the little loading circle spun on the screen, that he wouldn't get a call back. His name was poison. The financial press had had a field day with the collapse of Aegis Tech. The headlines were brutal. The Emperor's new code, how Arthur Sterling faked his way to the top. K Global seizes fraudulent tech startup. From penthouse to pavement, the hubris of Arthur Sterling. When the truth came out about Project Sentinel, that Arthur had stolen his wife's intellectual property and leveraged it to build an empire of sand, the tech industry collectively locked its doors to him. No venture capitalist would touch him. No board would hire him. He was a walking liability, a cautionary tale whispered among junior developers. Arthur closed the laptop and rubbed his tired eyes. He reached for his mug of instant coffee, grimacing at the bitter, burnt taste. He missed the $4,000 espresso machine Clara had let him keep in the divorce. He had sold it to a pawn shop 3 months ago to make rent. To distract himself from the gnawing anxiety in his stomach, Arthur picked up the television remote and clicked on the small, outdated TV resting on a milk crate in the corner of the room. He flipped to Bloomberg television out of a masochistic habit he couldn't break. The screen flickered to life, showing the bright, bustling floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The anchor, a polished woman with a crisp British accent, was speaking animatedly. And the markets are reacting overwhelmingly positively to the news. K Global's stock surged an unprecedented 12% this morning, following the announcement of their new philanthropic venture, the Sentinel Initiative. Arthur's heart stopped. He dropped the remote onto the card table. The camera cut to a live press conference. Standing behind a sleek podium, flanked by the mayor of New York and several prominent tech leaders, was Clara. She looked radiant. Her hair was styled in soft, elegant waves, and she wore a tailored, cream-colored blazer that exuded quiet, unshakable power. She was no longer the hidden, quiet wife, nor was she the wrathful executioner from the Pierre Hotel. She was simply a titan, fully realized and comfortable in her domain. The Sentinel Initiative, Clara's voice floated through the cheap speakers of Arthur's television, steady and commanding, is a multi-billion-dollar fund dedicated to providing grants, resources, and legal protection to independent female developers and engineers in the technology sector. A polite ripple of applause broke out among the press corps. For too long, Clara continued, looking directly into the cameras, her eyes conveying a deep, knowing wisdom. Brilliant minds have had their work co-opted, stolen, or overshadowed by those with louder voices and deeper pockets. The Sentinel Initiative ensures that the architects of our digital future retain ownership of their creations, their equity, and their dignity. Arthur stared at the screen. Unable to breathe, she had taken the very code he had used to build his fraudulent ego and turned it into a weapon for good. She was using his failure, his betrayal, as the foundational bedrock for a legacy that would outlive them both. The anchor's voice returned as the press conference faded out. A brilliant move by Clara Kensington, who has proven herself to be a formidable successor to her father's empire. In just 7 months, she has restructured K Global into a modern powerhouse, focusing on ethical investments and transparent leadership. She is, without a doubt, the most powerful woman in tech today. Arthur reached out with a trembling hand and pressed the power button on the television. The screen went black, leaving him in the silent, oppressive gloom of his apartment. He looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the stack of past-due bills on the counter, and the empty, lonely space that constituted his entire world. He thought back to that rainy Tuesday in the lawyer's office. He remembered the smug satisfaction he had felt sliding those divorce papers across the table. He remembered offering her a used Volvo and a condescending pat on the head. He had thought she was nothing. He had thought she was a stepping stone, a quiet, unremarkable background character in the grand, sweeping movie of his life. He had been so incredibly, fatally blind. Clara had never needed Arthur's money, his status, or his protection. She had simply wanted his partnership. She had offered him the one thing money couldn't buy: genuine, unpretentious loyalty. and he had tossed it into the garbage because it wasn't shiny enough for his ego. Arthur put his head down on the cheap particle board table, the cold surface pressing against his forehead. There was no anger left in him. There was no resentment toward Clara, or even Chloe. There was only a profound, crushing emptiness. He had won the divorce. He had kept his company. He had strutted out of that conference room, believing he was the master of his universe. But in his ruthless pursuit of everything, Arthur Sterling had masterminded his own absolute descent into nothing. Arthur's catastrophic downfall serves as a brutal testament to the blinding nature of arrogance and the illusion of self-made superiority. He equated quietness with weakness and kindness with a lack of ambition, fundamentally failing to understand the true source of his own success. Clara's revelation was not merely an act of vengeance, but a necessary correction, a mirror held up to Arthur's hollow ego. He believed he was discarding dead weight, entirely unaware that he was severing his only tether to reality and genuine worth. Ultimately, the story illuminates a timeless truth. Respect and integrity are the true currencies of power. When we underestimate the quiet architects of our lives, prioritizing surface-level prestige over profound loyalty, we risk building our empires on sand. Arthur didn't just lose his wealth. He lost the very foundation of his humanity, leaving him alone in the ruins of his own hubris.